Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon. My name is Dana White, and I'm a host of the Myth Salon. And I have the distinct pleasure today to bring to you somebody whose dissertation committee I served on. This is Dr. Dennis Hall. And the first time that I met Denny, I was completely blown away by the quality of his oral defense. He had a beautiful presentation. I immediately booked him for the October Myth Salon. Well, as October would be, we had an encounter with the people at the UC Santa Cruz on monsters. And I thought, okay, I think monsters is a little more appropriate than labyrinths for October. Well, he was brokenhearted. And I apologized and I said, but give me a couple months. I'll put this thing together in January and we'll build you a stellar panel for your Myth Salon. Little did I know that in the time being, we'd come in contact with one of his primary resources, Reverend Dr. Lauren Artress, and she came to us through Phil Cousineau, with whom I am deeply grateful for his friendship and collaboration. And the next thing I know, Lauren's on the panel. Well, Denny, of course, was completely surprised and grateful to all of us. Then I called on John Bucher, who has been a long friend, who had just completed an Atlas Obscura three-part course on labyrinths. This thing is lining up to be fabulous. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to invoke a moment of silence, because for what ought to be said today, the labyrinth is a medium to invoke silence, to invoke reflection, and it's a meditative medium, and it's a medium in itself, and it's an idea whose time has really come. So let's go for a moment of silence, and then we'll get this going. Oh, wonderful. Okay. I have a poem that I want to read, and it's called The Labyrinth. I discovered the gods governing existence when I found myself in a cadenza, in the labyrinth that is my soul's journey. I recognize the call that emerges when things change or with departure from the path. The gods freely move about in the open space of the cadenza, for they are not framed by paths or particular ways of being. Paths make things clear, where I am headed, how far I have come. The gods reveal themselves in a cadenza, in the stillness, in the sacred space. And until the first notes of my original nature start the song, there is silence. The silence is breathtaking, a stark contrast to the lyric of the path that always tells me which way to go. Only the way spiraling into myself will complete the journey. This labyrinth has become my life's work. The notes of the song emerging from the cadenza are my own. I aim my stride down the only path I can see, for I have been given the compass I already owned. The cadenza slips from experience into memory. The path that brought me here is no longer visible. But I am immersed in curiosity, trust, and the love of adventure, longing to arrive at a place I do not know. though I realize when I arrive, I will recognize it as feeling like home. All I can do is journey to the end, where I know it will become apparent. I must begin the journey again, as empty as a newborn. Armed with my song, am I singing the song? Or is the song singing me? Have I done this before? I do not know. The only thing familiar is this song. The way onward is in. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Dennis Hall, who is coming to us actually from Maui. And I can't wait to hear how your presentation is going to go, Denny. So welcome. Feel gratitude already.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I just want to say hello to everyone, old friends and new. Of course, John and Will, I know from Pacifica, Lauren and Dawn from Veriditas. I had the good fortune to cross paths with Dennis Slattery when he was emeritus at Pacifica. Phil and Sheila, my new friends, it's nice to meet you. And I'm ready to get started, Dana, whenever you're ready. Okay, so history and phenomenology of the labyrinth. When Dana invited me to appear on Myth Salon, he said, I present on history and phenomenology of the labyrinth. And that is quite an attempt. That is a great big subject. So I'm going to present one small slice of the history of the labyrinth and one small slice of the phenomenology of the labyrinth. Every discussion about labyrinth, I think, should be begun by defining what is a labyrinth. And that is something that I'll do in a non-traditional way, or perhaps a very traditional way today. We tend to associate the labyrinth today with its contemporary definition as a unicursal, a place with one path, a unicursal path that goes to the center, and you follow the same path out. In this group in particular, but I think in the labyrinth world, this Chart's model labyrinth is probably the most common. And we also have a traditional labyrinth. People have done interesting things with labyrinths. There's the triple labyrinth. So there's a lot going on with the labyrinth. The labyrinth, though, has its roots not in unicursality. The labyrinth has its roots in as a multicursal structure. And that's where I'm going to present today, is back in the time when labyrinth meant multiple paths. And I'll start there. What I did is I examined the labyrinth as a character in the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. And so my task was to figure out what a labyrinth meant to the people who created and sustained that myth. So that was my starting point. I approached the task with what I like to call a mytho-historical lens. And that is that I looked at the story as it was situated in time in historical events. And I like to say that I'm not alone in this. None other than Hesiod and Herodotus, both used in their own way. They both used mytho-historical lenses. Hesiod wrote about the time of heroes, which was the time before he lived in. And that's what he understood as before he lived in the time of writing. And before that was the time of heroes, when gods walked the earth. And Herodotus delineated his time as the historicon And the time that preceded him was the Mythicon. And that's the period in Greek history where history was told through stories. So it's not a new approach, but I thought it was very appropriate for this myth. I want to talk a little bit about how I formed my opinions and where I got my ideas. And that is what I like to call the four giants of labyrinth scholarship. And I begin with William Matthews, who wrote a wonderful compendium in 1922 called Mazes and Labyrinths. And it was, as far as I know, it was the first attempt to put all the knowledge of labyrinths into one book. And Matthews dedicated the book to his daughter Zeta, and he said it was her frolicking on labyrinths that gained his interest. But in her memoir, and after her father's death, she pointed out that he had access to papers that had a labyrinth on the Arras front in the First World War. That was in northern France. Matthews saw some of the worst fighting, some of the bloodiest and deadliest fighting of the war. And when he came home, he focused on labyrinths. And he wrote this book in a short 2.5 years after returning. He got this book out. And Zeta swears that just means that he could not have inspired her. And Matthews is still quoted today. One of the great things about Matthews' book is it's in the public domain, and it is a wonderful place to find images that you don't need a license for, because the whole thing is in the public domain. Following Matthews, it wasn't until 1983 that Herman Kern, who was an art historian, was commissioned to write Through the Labyrinth, the history of the labyrinth. And it was published in 1983 in German. And it is encyclopedic. And I see if I can read these notes here. Architectural, astrological, mythological. It's a wonderful book. And it encompasses so much of labyrinth history, from early petroglyphs found in India 4,000 years ago up until his time in 1983. In 2000, Jeff Sayward was one of the two editors that produced this English language version, of which I'm showing you the cover. Fascinating book. It is a must-have primary resource for anyone who wants to do serious work in labyrinth history. Our next giant, there you go, is of Jeff Sayward. Jeff is a co-founder of the Labyrinth Society. He maintains Labyrinthinos, and I encourage everyone here to go to labyrinthinos.net. Is a labyrinth and maze resource, photo library, and archive, and it is extensive. Sayward is known as the reigning labyrinth historian today. And he also publishes Cardroia, which is the Journal of Mazes and Labyrinths, and it's the only journal for mazes and labyrinths. And finally, our panelist, Reverend Dr. Lauren Artress, is the fourth giant of labyrinth scholarship. When she created Walking a Sacred Path, she brought the labyrinth into the 20th century in the West, and she brought the labyrinth alive again. She's also founded Veritas, the Worldwide Labyrinth Project. And I have to acknowledge all four of the giants, but I have to spend some time talking about Walking a Sacred Path and Lauren's work, because it was my introduction to labyrinth scholarship. And some people will probably that statement might throw some people off if they've read Walking a Sacred Path, because it is not an academic book. It is not a scholarly book. This is a book written for accessibility, and it is written to reach the widest number of people. And in it, Lauren details a philosophy that has taken over labyrinth meditation and spiritual use of labyrinth. One thing I should have pointed out on that previous slide is that when you look at the three men, they all focused on history, phenomenology, geography, the weights and measures of the labyrinth, if you will. And until Walking a Sacred Path, there was no resource for spiritual access to labyrinth. And it is, again, it's wonderfully written in that the academic rigor in this book is fantastic. I know because I followed every thread of it. I was fascinated when I first read the book. And for anyone that doesn't know, what Lauren has done is taken an affective prayer method from Saint Teresa of Avila, and she has applied it to spiritual use in the labyrinth. And I've read Saint Teresa's Interior Castle. I read her. I love the title. My Life is Written by Myself. I read everything she had to say about prayer, and I compared that back to what is in Walking a Sacred Path, and it is a very well-founded method that takes an affective prayer of leaving the soul open to receive, and applies it to how to enter, be in, and return from a labyrinth as a spiritual journey. What's wonderful is not only is it completely accessible, but the mystical experiences that are described are completely attainable through this method, because the method is sound. And I know Lauren says this time and again, is don't expect an epiphany. You don't get epiphanies every time you practice spirituality in the labyrinth, and you don't, but you can by employing the method of affective prayer, the opening. She's taken purgation, illumination, and union, which are the aspects of the prayers. And then she made that accessible to more secular people by analogizing that to releasing, receiving, and returning. So anyone that picks up this book, whether they would like to have a spiritual journey based on that type of prayer, or if they just wanted to have a meditative journey and for themselves, the methodology works. So when I looked at, when I began my research, what I thought was, is there, well, actually, what I thought was, how do you top that? And you don't, because it is its own wonderful thing. Now, what I did think was this methodology is based on Christian mythology. And as a mythologist, I mean sacred stories. And so it is based on Christian mythology. And I thought, well, the labyrinth has existed, the form of the labyrinth has existed much longer than Christianity. So is there an earlier mythological exemplar that might be applied to meditative labyrinth walking? So I began to look back in history at myths, and very much hoping that I could find something that predated the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, but alas, I could not. So that is the myth that I chose. And so essentially what I came up with is what I've come to call Theseus's labyrinth experience, because it is an exemplar in its own right, and it is just one experience. My research started when outside of that myth, my research started on labyrinths with the 4 labyrinths of antiquity. And I put them up on the map here. The one in the center is of course the one on Crete. The oldest is the one on the bottom, which is the Egyptian labyrinth at Harawa. There's a island of Lemnos, which is north of Crete. You can see it's the one on the right, very close to Troy, coincidentally. And then there's the Etruscan labyrinth, sometimes known as the Italian labyrinth, at Clusium. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those. The Egyptian labyrinth, I love this picture because it is, you can see a labyrinth depicted in front of the pyramid. If you look in the center of that square, there's the form of a labyrinth. And this picture was drawn in 2009 by a modern artist. And I get the biggest kick out of it because the symbol of a unicrystal labyrinth is so persistent that anytime we say the word labyrinth, that's what comes to mind. But in fact, the Egyptian labyrinth wasn't anything that we would consider a labyrinth at all. It mostly is described as a tomb. The only extant written description of an eyewitness that we have is Herodotus, who's known as the first, Greek historian. And he visited Egypt, and he saw for himself, he saw the Egyptian labyrinth. And that written description is the only surviving description of that labyrinth. The labyrinth on Lemnos, it doesn't get a lot of chatter. Pliny says that it was the ruins were available in his day, which would have been the 1st century, the Common Era, and not much is written about it. I can find no evidence of archaeological find. It's only in Pliny's catalog of the 4. And he just talks about it being similar to the Cretan labyrinth, except for it was more imposing because of its columns. The picture I chose, the Shield of Achilles, is because Lemnos, coincidentally, is the main god worshipped on Lemnos was Hephaestus, who made the Shield of Achilles, and he's talked about in Homer. And Homer's reference to the Ariadne's dancing green is depicted on this shield, and Homer talks about it in the Iliad. And so it's the earliest reference we have in writing to the labyrinth in Crete, or any labyrinth for that matter. I just thought that was a fitting image for an otherwise labyrinth that is otherwise unseen. The Etruscan labyrinth, again, very small, in very small place in history. In fact, Pliny says the only reason he wants to mention it is because it was so much grander than the Egyptian labyrinth, it didn't exist in his time. He was working from a written account by Morrow, I believe. And anyway, he just included it as one of the big labyrinths. So, and the last one that they talked to, of course, they referred to as Daedalus' labyrinth on Knossos, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in a bit. But everything is in comparison. When Pliny talks about the 4 labyrinths of antiquity, everything is in comparison to the Cretan labyrinth. And so, because the Cretan labyrinth has never been seen, and there's never been any archaeological finds, and no one has. So the myth is the primary source for this labyrinth. So in their search to catalog this labyrinth, to name it and identify it and describe it, they use these other four labyrinths as descriptors for what the Cretan labyrinth had to have looked like. This Canina is imagining here. There's an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Canina, who died in 1856. And in the last, I don't know exactly when he drew this, but certainly before 1856. But he drew this based on Herodotus's description of the Egyptian labyrinth, which I think is wonderful, because I've read Herodotus's description time and again, and I couldn't come up with this without Canina's imagining. Which is quite popular. And again, this is an image from Matthew's book. Herodotus did not describe the Egyptian labyrinth as dangerous in any way. He described it as confusing. And he said when he wandered it, they couldn't find their way, and they had a hard time finding their way. But he described it as amazement and amusement. So being lost in the Egyptian labyrinth wasn't considered to be unsafe or dangerous in any way, just disorienting. Oddly enough, and again, Canina died in 1856. In 1888, the archaeological find of the Egyptian labyrinth was Flinders Petrie, a British archaeologist, found it, and it looks kind of like Pequeno's drawing that I showed you at first, in that it sits in front of the pyramid, just as Herodotus described. Petrie was able to excavate part of it. There was actually a Roman town that had been built on top of the labyrinth, which impeded Petrie. He never finished his excavation, but he did get underneath that layer, and he did map out what you see here. That's as much of it as he mapped out. And if you look at what Herodotus described and what Canini imagined from the description, it's very close. It's very close. It very much validates Herodotus's eyewitness or claim that he was an eyewitness to it. Which brings us to Arthur Evans, who I clicked that a little early, but Arthur Evans was a very ambitious archaeologist. Started off as a geologist. His father was a geologist. And in his day, in the 19th century, many geologists became archaeologists because in their quest for rocks, they found ruins, and they built this field of archaeology. So many of you probably know that the city of Troy was found by a German named Schliemann, who the most wonderful description I have of Schliemann comes from Donald Kagan, the classicist, who says Schliemann was uneducated. He didn't have the benefit of a university education, so he wasn't smart enough to know that Troy wasn't a true story. And he very much, every university in Europe at the time thought that everything in Homer was fiction, was old legend. And Schliemann refused to believe it. And he found Troy, and then eventually found Mycenae. And he became terribly rich, because in the early days of archaeology, you just kept what you dug up. And Schliemann became richer than he was. And he had his moment of fame. And so when Evans found ruins on Crete, he began to dream that he could also prove a myth, just as Schliemann had proven a myth. So Evans set out to find the labyrinth at Knossos. And what he found is the palace at Knossos, and this is his drawing. It comes from his book, which, by the way, for anyone who wants them, all of Evan's books are available online. They're in the public domain. You can get good copies of all of them. They're entertaining. But here, when you put what he found beside Canini's imagining, which turns out to be what the Egyptian labyrinth looked like, and again, this is now Evans is some 25 years after Petrie, some 50 years after Schliemann. And so he knows these stories and he knows these pictures. And when he uncovers this palace, lo and behold, in his mind, he has found the labyrinth, the famed labyrinth of the myth. And that was his entire goal. And some of the, if you read the biography, it's called Minotaur. There's it's the biography of the archaeology of Arthur Evans. MacGillivray is written by Sandy MacGillivray. And MacGillivray points out in all the letters of how Evans did everything he could to push his round peg into a square hole and make this myth come true. Ultimately, he wasn't able to prove it, but the myth is still a wonderful myth. And so those four labyrinths are the way up until Roman times, up until Pliny, who wrote contemporaneously with Ovid, roughly. That was the notion in the Greek and Roman mind of what a labyrinth was. It was everything that they had to say about a labyrinth was based on the labyrinth in Crete and the one from the myth. And then from Herodotus on, it became comparisons to the Egyptian labyrinth. And I want to offer what I think is their other influence, their other very big influence. And this is a drawing from Schliemann's excavation of, towards the end of his excavation of Troy. And when I put this up along with what Homer has to say about Troy, and in the pictures that you'll see in a minute, you just get this wonderful idea that this notion of a building, as the other four were described, these are buildings that were meant to delay and confuse people and inhibit their passage through these buildings. And so they were used as a form of defense. In fact, it wasn't until the first century before the Common Era, it was Diodorus Siculus who wrote a wonderful rendition of the myth, but he was the very first to compare the Egyptian labyrinth to the labyrinth on Crete. And he did so, he said that Daedalus had made his way to Crete, or made his way to Egypt rather, been impressed by the labyrinth, and then went to Crete and built one 1/100th of its size for Minos to house the Minotaur. So that was those were the ideas that they were working with, of protection, delay, confuse. And then what Homer has to say about the way Troy was built was the same. Essentially, the Troy was built in layers to delay and confuse. This graphic in front of you is from the Turkish Archaeological Society, and it shows how the city of Troy was built over time. And Troy is a very ancient city. In fact, the Troy of the Iliad was the 7th city built on that site. There were 6 cities that had flourished and gone away and then been rebuilt. And Homer, the characters in Homer, they saw and attacked Troy 7. And if you get an idea of the shape on the bottom right of the high walls and the many gates and the winding roads. And again, this is also from the Turkish archaeological, their government agency for archaeology, of what Troy looked like, Troy 7 would have looked like to in Homeric times. And again, just the citadel without the surrounding houses. It's not hard to see, for me, successive rings in the wide roads. It's labyrinthine. It is. Once attackers are in one gate, they have to negotiate the path to find another gate to get into that, and it's layer after layer of labyrinth. And this is a very bad image that shows what it looks like from the top, which again strikes me as very labyrinthine. So this is the labyrinth from the myth. The notion of labyrinth from the myth is that it is something that is formidable, strong, and it's meant to protect, to delay, and confuse. And so when you put the Minotaur in the labyrinth, you then have the protection, oddly, works both ways. It's the most fun for me is that it ostensibly the labyrinth is built to protect the world from the Minotaur, but the labyrinth also protects the Minotaur from what's outside, and it successfully protects him for at least 27 years. There's 3 Enneatic tributes every 9 years. Athens is forced to give a tribute that's fed into the labyrinth, where they do not prevail against the Minotaur. In many of the renditions, they're eaten. So he is protected from people who can get in and hurt him, and the world is protected from him. And that is part of my evaluation of the myth. But I want to stick on with the labyrinth. And it brings us now, and it's still talking about Troy. This image, probably everyone here has seen before. It was found on an enoche, or a wine jug, in Tuscany, and the 8th century BCE. So it is contemporaneous with Homer. So this image, all the talking I've just done to explain that labyrinths to these, the meaning to the people of that time was that it was a building meant to defend through strength and deception. Yet here we have that labyrinth depicted as a unicursal model that we see today. And if please don't wait for an explanation. I do not have one. I do not know of one. The changeover from the idea of a 3-dimensional building that has a unicursal or multicursal path to get through it, and this symbol that has a single path, and how these two became known and conflated, it still isn't known. But here on this enoche, you'll see the word Tria is engraved in the labyrinth, and that most scholars believe is a reference to Troy, although it could be linguistically, it could be winding paths in Latin. There's a Latin word that's similar, and it could mean that, but this is in Etruscan. So I associate it with Troy. Most scholars associate it with Troy, but I hold that even if it's not, even if it meant winding path, that's not the most important aspect of it. The most important aspect is that we continue to associate Troy with labyrinth, even today. In the the Cerdroia, the name of the journal that Jeff Sayward runs, is a Welsh word, and it like Truia, Cerdroia has a disputed etymology. In Welsh, it could mean windings and turnings, or city of windings, or it could mean Troy. And so it depends on what you want to believe. But the Welsh who created grass labyrinths, and it was very popular. If you read Matthews, it is very popular amongst shepherd boys in the 19th century, that they would build labyrinths and run through labyrinths for entertainment while they were out tending the flocks. And by the way, running the labyrinth was the most common phrase in Great Britain until sometime toward the middle of the 20th century, and then it became walking the labyrinth. But running the labyrinth, and of course those are hedge mazes, was the thing to do. So between this Anoche and its affiliation with Troy, and Cerdroia and its affiliation with Troy, we have this historical link between Troy and the labyrinth. And that's what made me seek out those images to see if there was anything that definitively linked them. And there's not. There's just my conjecture at this point. In between this Anoche and the Welsh of the 19th century, we have Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. And in the Aeneid, Virgil wrote of Troises Luces, which I know I'm mispronouncing, and I apologize, but it means Game of Troy. And it was done on horseback, and it was played by actors who were acting out the Trojan migration to Italy, to form Italy after the fall of Rome in the Homeric epics. And so Virgil claims it. I think many people, most of us here are familiar with the critique on Virgil's works, of it being commissioned and being written with an emperor over his shoulder. But it's the Game of Troy is definitively dated back to Julius Caesar, which is some 100 years before Virgil. So it again, he didn't make it up. It was something that existed, but again, the affiliation with Troy is what made it a labyrinth. So that's what I took into my exploration of what I wanted to call Theseus's labyrinth experience, and it gave me a completely different labyrinth to work with. Right, the one that I learned about. Again, I think I should have noted this earlier. Not only have read everything that Lauren's written, but I'm also Veritas trained labyrinth facilitator. I did my training with Lauren. I am a member of the association. I am in a very active labyrinth guild where I routinely facilitate for people in public walks, mostly people early in their learning, and also we do workshops, and we teach people how to use the labyrinth for spiritual and meditative gain. And it is a system that it is a philosophy that I am very comfortable with, and that I fully embrace, and that I use and I teach. And so when I found this, it's a very different labyrinth for me. And so I then began to think, how could this be applicable to meditative labyrinth walking? Everything I've been taught has been about purgation, releasing the daily worries, releasing the ego, opening the heart, being available for thoughts that arise, being available for divine inspiration. And that is a form of mindfulness meditation that's very, very effective. And that's what I knew. And there's no way that Theseus's labyrinth experience can be analogized to that type of labyrinth walk. So I began to do more research rather on types of meditation. And, there is abundant research on labyrinth meditation, and there is abundant research on the neurology, what happens to your brain when you're meditating, and what happens to your brain when you're meditating in a labyrinth, a form of dynamic meditation, as opposed to static meditation, which is sitting. And it turns out the literature suggests that as many as 3 out of 5 people see a change in their prefrontal cortex activity while walking. And it's the type of change in activity that facilitates an opening of the mind and an entrance into a meditative state. And that's the physiological reason of why labyrinth meditation works. But again, how do I apply this to this labyrinth that is meant to confuse? It's meant to delay. It's meant to protect from what's inside. So I performed, and I'm going to gloss this very briefly and hand this over to Lauren. But what I did is I performed a psychological interpretation of the myth, and I used the methodology of the Jungian Marie-Louise von Franz, who I very much admire her approach to fairy tales and archetypes. And so I applied her lens to this myth. And what I found out is that psychologically, this is the myth of Theseus venturing to Crete to slay the Minotaur has the psychological analogy of an internal conflict, of how to approach an internal conflict. And so then my research in meditation began as a search for what meditation works for internal conflict, because the mindfulness meditation is focused on accepting what arises, which is wonderful, but that's not targeted, right? That's kind of a you get what you get type of situation, which again is wonderful. But if you want to target a conflict an inner conflict, a psychic conflict, there is a method in the attentive family of meditation. It's called deconstructive meditation, and it employs a dialogue, an internal dialogue. It is a type of meditation where you dialogue, which as opposed to, say, Saint Teresa's approach to affective prayer is to remove dialogue, is to just open yourself up to take away of anything that you want to say to God and just be attentive to what's received. So this is the very opposite type of meditation, and it involves an interrogation. And there is a way in theory in which this can be a meditative practice in the labyrinth. And it involves a list of questions, a partial knowledge of internal conflict, and a very targeted agenda on how to approach the questions. And the analogies between the thread and the sword, those are analogized as the tools of meditation. And the line of questionings can be the thread to keep you from becoming lost, psychologically lost, because there is an analogy that Um, Even though you would meditate this way on a unicursal labyrinth where you can't become physically lost, you can become lost in thought. And so you can follow that line of questioning and approach an actual Minotaur, your own personal Minotaur, which would be the internal conflict that you're trying to address. So I think I've spoken long enough. I'll leave you with this image of my favorite labyrinth, the beautiful um, Chartres replica in Trinity Cathedral in Portland, Oregon, which Lauren helped get installed years and years ago. But that's how I characterize the labyrinth as a character in the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur.
Amazing. Thank you again, Dennis. You've illuminated the labyrinth with threads that will continue to guide us long beyond this evening. The panel that's gathered around your work is overwhelming, and we've had a few here. It is a testament to your work and a group I'm honored to bring into the space. We'll bring them in now and then hear from Lauren, who's of course a living legend, as many of us are responding around her. She'll respond to your presentation and take us a bit deeper into the labyrinth in her own way. And from here, we'll all join and engage the topic together. Though our introductions now will be short, I want to encourage everyone to check out the page for the event I posted in the chat, which includes extended bios and labyrinth-related invitations from the panelists. It's also where you can find the event recording when it's posted. We all know Dana White, host of the Myth Salon, contributing faculty member of Pacifica's Myth Degrees and author of numerous volumes on mythology. But you, of course, also know Dennis, which is incredibly cool, and I think cool for all of us who have been coming to these myth salons for all these years. We're joined as usual by our friend, Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, who taught me to see the labyrinth and the Nautilus in the Odyssey. He's a distinguished emeritus professor in the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 33 volumes of poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. His most recent titles include The Way of Myth, Stories, Subtle Wisdom, and The Fiction in Our Convictions. His website, which is shared on the page, is DennisPatrickSlattery.com, and it includes a series of blogs, paintings, adventure invitations, and online courses. John Bucher is a mythologist and story expert back with us tonight, who's been featured on the BBC, History Channel, LA Times, and numerous other international outlets. He serves as executive director for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and is a writer, podcaster, storyteller, and speaker. He's worked with government and cultural leaders around the world, as well as organizations such as HBO, DC Comics, Paramount Pictures, Nickelodeon, A24 Films, the John Maxwell Leadership Foundation, and Atlas Obscura, for which he's offering courses on labyrinths, again, which you can find in the links on the page. John has served as a producer, consultant, and writer for numerous film, television, and virtual reality projects. He is the author of 6 books, including best-selling Storytelling for Virtual Reality. John has worked with New York Times bestselling authors, YouTube influencers, Eisner winners, Emmy winners, Academy Award nominees, magicians, and cast members from Saturday Night Live. He holds a PhD in myth and depth psychology and has spoken on 6 continents about using the power of story and myth to reframe how individuals, organizations, cultures, and nations believe and behave. Hey, John. Sheila Spremulli is with us tonight, who applying her early work as a labor and delivery room nurse and donor birth doula, has completed a self-designed BA in 2010 that blended her interest in prenatal science and the wayfinding behaviors of human embryogenesis and birth. Her embodied knowledge of biodynamic craniosacral theory and certifications in perinatal psychology and health education, Veritas labyrinthian facilitation, and eco-spiritual direction inspired her to create laser-cut, birth psychology-informed labyrinths and artwork. Her Mythologium in 2023, Prenatal Theseus and the Transitus Labyrinth, an eco-spiritual inspiration of womb life, and her Transitus Lab work, poster, nests our biomythic beginnings in the deep time story of cosmogenesis and aligns the transformative stages of reconceiving ourselves as a species with the powers of the universe. Her work can be found at chartres4peacelabyrinth.com, again on the page we shared. Hey, Sheila. Phil is back with us tonight. Phil is an award-winning writer and filmmaker, story consultant and editor, travel leader, and inspired speaker on myth in the modern world. His fascination with art, literature, and history of culture has taken him from Michigan to Marrakesh, Iceland to the Amazon, in a worldwide search for what the ancients called the soul of the world. With more than 40 books and 30 script writing credits to his name, the omnipresent influence of myth in modern life is a thread that works and runs through all of his work. His book includes Stoking the Creative Fires, Once and Future Myths, The Art of Pilgrimage, The Hero's Journey, Wordcatcher, The Painted Word, and the Oldest Story in the World, The Book of Roads, The Accidental Aphorist, and The Lost Notebooks of Sisyphus. And of course, he's doing an event with Lauren through the Veritas organization, which we hope you'll check out as well and is posted on that page. As the executive director of the Veritas organization, I'd like to introduce Don Matheny, who's with us tonight. Hi, Don. Don has a bachelor's degree in psychology from UC Santa Cruz, a master's degree in counseling, and a doctorate in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Don started her work life in the nonprofit sector, working in a children's residential treatment program in a volunteer bureau, and then as an executive director of a shelter program for women and children who had been victims of domestic violence. She ended her 30 years in county government to accept this position with Veritas, and her dissertation and expertise is in the study of dreams and qualitative research, which she brings to her work with the Labyrinth. She got involved with the Labyrinth by attending and then assisting with Women's Dream Quests, and is delighted to spread the work of Lauren Artress through Veritas, which spreads and promotes the Labyrinth as a psycho-spiritual tool. Okay, and now I get to introduce Reverend Dr. Lauren Artress, who is the founder of Veritas. She is the author of Walking a Sacred Path, Rediscovering the Labyrinth as a Spiritual Tool, the Sand Labyrinth Kit, and the Sacred Path Companion, a guide to walking the labyrinth to heal and transform. Dr. Artress is a priest of the Episcopal Church, and her home parish is Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. She is credited with introducing the walking meditation back into the Christian tradition and the labyrinth back into Western culture. In 1991, she replicated the medieval Chartres Cathedral 11th Circuit Labyrinth at Grace Cathedral, first in canvas, and then in 2007, creating the campaign for Grace Cathedral to install a permanent limestone labyrinth to replace the tapestry labyrinth. And I know John was just there this last week, as he shared before we got started. Incredible. Thank you, Lauren, for being with us. I look forward to your response to Denny's presentation, and then we'll all join you when you invite us in.
Well, I'm delighted. This is my first Myth Salon, and I'm just delighted, Dana, to be asked, and thanks, Phil, for that. And there's lots to say for labyrinths. And Dennis, thank you so much for your presentation. I didn't know about the 4 labyrinths of inequity, and I also didn't actively associate the labyrinth with Troy. So, I mean, this is kind of a new lesson, and that's the beauty, of course, of myth, right? That we can come at it in so many different ways and so many different angles. But let me start in the contemporary, and then let me end with how in Chartres Cathedral, people believe that the center of the labyrinth there had the Minotaur in it. So I'll kind of go full circle that way, if that's all right. So we at Grace Cathedral began labyrinth work in 1991. And at that time, I was canon pastor. Some of you know this story. I was canon pastor, and that's when the AIDS crisis was moving into the epidemic. Similar to what we've just been through with COVID, at first people didn't know how it was transmitted, what's going on, people are dying, all of that. And as canon pastor, which means I'm the senior pastor of the congregation, canon, that's what that means, department head. You know, it was my job to step in and do something. And, you know, we did do a lot of administrative work. We set up programs for the worried well. We did support groups for people getting tested. We did all of that. We welcomed parents coming to San Francisco to be with, at that time, usually their son, who would be ill in San Francisco. And of course, Grace Cathedral is a big civic church where people, if you're in trouble, you come, and it's a wonderful, open-hearted, open-minded Christianity there. So that began it, and I really want to confirm that this is the time, and the labyrinth does want to come forward, because around that time and after, I mean, some of you and many of you know, Jean Houston introduced me to the labyrinth. I went back, I was on a sabbatical 1 month, thinking I want to leave the cathedral. I knew that the AIDS work and ministry, I was burnt out. I knew it wasn't my work. And it's really helpful to have work that you know isn't your work because it moves you on to keep searching. When I went to Jean Houston, they just taped an 11 circuit labyrinth on the floor, and boom, you know, I walked it, and I tell that story in Walking a Sacred Path. So when I came back to Grace Cathedral, we then created a canvas, and again, just at the right time, and this is what I mean by it wants to emerge. People began to come up to me and report their dreams. People were just getting up in the middle of the night and seeing a labyrinth on their living room floor. You see, this wants to break through to the human psyche. And Jeff Sayward makes an excellent point that every time that we are in society is in rapid change and demanding and challenging times, that's when the labyrinth reemerges. And that has been true throughout history. We begin to pick that up, the rhythm of that in the Middle Ages and throughout, during the Industrial Revolution, the 1800s. All of this, again, has these periodic times that it emerges. And I think there's not even an argument that right now we are in rapidly changing, not always going in the right direction kind of feeling to our Western world, certainly. So with this emerging, the ministry just came, and I would call it a ministry because at that point we were working with so many people that needed to really kind of find a place where they could find themselves. Now, let me say more about that, because this kind of weaves on what Dennis was saying. In the beginning, opening this, in 1991, folks, people didn't know what a labyrinth was. And of course, it was always called a maze. And you have to be honest there that, of course, in my mind, they're almost directly opposed to each other or oppositional in that sense. And this is what you're pointing to, Dennis, you know, that the multicursal and the unicursal, and I'm working only with unicursal. But they are confused in the Romantic languages. There's only one word in French for labyrinth and maze, and that's labyrinth. You see, so there's an honest confusion there as well in the history and the epistemology of our language. But the sense that it was really truly a build it and they will come. That was it. And so just to continue to listen to people's stories, to listen and see what people were experiencing, that was really the first. And I have still hundreds of letters. I'm going through again because I'm writing a chapter for someone else's book on creative practices. And just hundreds of stories from people. Now, for me, over the years, the work with the labyrinth has really refined itself more. First of all, when we are in trauma and change and we don't know where we're going, and nobody, Western culture doesn't know where they're going, we need to be embodied. We need to be embodied. And that the labyrinth, by walking, by moving your body, I always call myself a failed meditator. And failed, yes, but what am I comparing it to is sitting meditation. And then once I started walking, it's like, oh man, this is great. My mind just kind of drains down, and okay, I let myself, and this would be in the Christian tradition called the cataphatic path as compared to the apathetic path. And in secular research, and understand, folks, yes, the labyrinth is in the Christian tradition. It's a wonderful, rich template, but it's also universal. It's an archetypal symbol. And so it's far broader, and that's why it's inclusive for all traditions around the world, or people who are looking for their path. that it's totally inclusive in my mind. So with the labyrinth being embodied, that's something that we need in our world right now. Because otherwise we don't know how to handle fear. Fear makes us ricochet around inside of ourselves. And when we're grounded, we know how to be able to do that, how to be with that. So that's one element of the labyrinth that's really become in focus for me. And a second one would be, and Dennis, you referred to this in another way, you walk in to the in-between world. You walk into liminal space. So when you're moving and being in present, if you can allow your mind just to quiet. Now, and I'm not saying you're not clearing your mind, you're just being at peace with the flow of your mind, because your mind is at peace with your body and the flow of your body. And then as you walk into that space, if you're carrying an issue, or I call it a question in your heart, often we don't know that. We don't know we're doing that, but we got some kind of question. And then that opens us up to receive. And I'm to receive from here, to receive from the earth. It's very much like Einstein said, you know, modern day problems cannot be solved on the same level that they were created on. And so it allows us to take in the bigger picture. And then when you're embodied with that thought, that insight is yours. It's not like dreams. Sometimes it is, where you need to write it down in order to keep it. Oftentimes it's yours. That insight is yours from the labyrinth. And so that liminal space. And in a way, let me bring in the Minotaur for a moment, because the Minotaur is in between space. Understand that the Minotaur was a punishment because of the adulterous relationship that the queen of Minos had with a bull. And you see, and so here's this beast who's in between human and animal, so to speak. And I know that's old language. It's not the right thinking of, oh, one is the other, but it's an in-between hybrid space, so shall we say. And so the in-between world and the labyrinth is what's healing. It's Richard Rohr who says the only time you can change yourself is in transformational space, liminal space, that world in between, that place where you can reorganize. And you are indeed reorganizing your neuropathology as well, your neural pathways as well. Over the years, that's really come, for me, what I value most about the labyrinth. Now, there's many ways of using the labyrinth. It can be community building, it can be problem solving, it can be all of these ways, but I'm describing really what I feel is the essence of my work over these many years. So let me say a little bit more about the emergence of the labyrinth. In the Middle Ages, labyrinths did indeed come back in to consciousness. Then this is the 11th Circuit medieval labyrinth. And folks, it's important to know what labyrinth you're walking. Because if you don't know what labyrinth you're walking and it doesn't work for you, then you say, oh, the labyrinth doesn't work. Well, wait, what kind of labyrinth did you walk? And a lot of people won't know. There's many wonderful designs out there. I work with archetypal labyrinths because I feel they're tested and true and passed down through the generations and refined over time. But there are many contemporary labyrinths. In fact, there's even an understanding that, or a hope, I guess, some folks in the labyrinth world feel like there's a search for a new design. The chart design is fine, maybe, and they associate it too much with just Christianity, but they're looking for a new design. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could find something that would transform our human psyche, like the chart labyrinth can do? Not always. Like Dennis was saying, my line, Dennis, is if you come to the labyrinth expecting to get Shazammed, you're reducing your possibilities considerably, but it may happen. So that the labyrinth teaches so many things, expectations, and using everything as a metaphor in the labyrinth is a wonderful teaching. Well, during the Middle Ages, 23 of the cathedrals had labyrinths. 23. That's not some little new agey thing that Chartres Cathedral did, you see. Chartres Cathedral is probably the third, not quite sure about this, the third cathedral that put a labyrinth in. And because of the quality of the stone, the Beauce quarry stone, that quality hardened over time. A lot of the labyrinths, there's only 3 left. A lot of the labyrinth, their floors wore out. Some were torn up because they, were that old, terrible thinking, from the Middle Ages. And we're enlightened. We're enlightened. We're not going to worry about that. All these old things, let's get rid of them. And some were simply torn out because they were something, you're not allowed to have a direct experience of the holy. That's a main teaching, with all due respect, of the beauty mystical tradition. In the Roman Church, especially in the Middle Ages, you are not supposed to have a direct experience of the holy. It has to be mediated through a priest. See, so these tools that hold these patterns for the imagination and the intuition, this deep, deep human capacities that we practically, if we haven't ignored them, we certainly have made them a Cinderella of our senses and faculties and belittled them. And here in these templates of the archetypal labyrinths is a way to be able to understand the imagination, to clarify the imagination, to embrace our intuition. With the imagination, see, and I think this is another reason this is emerging, that the biggest faculty that we need, human capacity that we need, is imagination. The more embodied your imagination is, the clearer your insights and your clarity of your imagination. It's like tuning into a radio, when you get right on the station, and it's much clearer, easier to hear, easier to pay attention to. So let me come back to the Chartres Cathedral, because although that cathedral has had not a lot of war damage, it has some. And one from the French Revolution is that the center of the labyrinth was pulled up to be made into cannonballs. It was lead, brass, and copper, and very valuable at those times. And they pulled it up and, used them for cannonballs. So everybody, I love the metaphor. What's at the center of the labyrinth? It's blank because it was pulled up. But there is an understanding, I'm not 100% convinced, that the Minotaur was pictured in the center of the Chartres labyrinth. The reason I'm not convinced is because of Henry Adams' book, Chartres and Mount Saint Michel, where he says Chartres Cathedral is a woman's place. There's no fear, there's no hell, there's no damnation. So isn't that interesting? So I have this hesitation there with that. But if it were there, why would the Minotaur be in the center of the Chartres labyrinth? Well, the understanding, here it is, a Greek classical myth, right, in the center of a Christian medieval cathedral. The understanding was that the Minotaur then would be seen as a shadow or a devil, but a shadow figure. And again, the shadow is part of the unknown parts of ourselves. Everyone has shadow, and it's constant, and it's there, and it takes self-reflective awareness to bring it to present consciousness. But the sense that the Minotaur being there, I can understand that. Do you know what the name of the Minotaur was? Astrion. And what it means is star. Isn't that interesting? And so if the Minotaur were there, then how about Theseus? And Theseus in that tradition then, in the middle of a Roman Catholic medieval cathedral, is the savior figure. The savior figure. Okay. And he comes and kills the Minotaur because the tradition, as I understand it, Dennis, that you mentioned the word tribute, but the war between Athens and Sparta, and Athens was the loser, and then because they were the loser, they had to dedicate and give 7 of their most brilliant youth to be given to the Minotaur in order to keep them as a more defenseless country or city. So there we are with the Minotaur, and then the Theseus as the savior, and then Ariadne's thread figures in here too as well. And one of the things I'd like for us to consider, and this is a little off key, but not too much, understand that all of these myths had a pre-patriarchal meaning, and then were changed by patriarchy. And Ariadne is known as the Lady of the Labyrinths. She was a goddess on the island of Minos. She was a goddess before in the pre-patriarchal stories, right? And then later, when patriarchy came in, she went from a goddess to being the king's daughter, daddy's daughter kind of thing. And so her story is quite different than what we're talking about. But I do want to point you toward a resource, The Dance of the Dissonant Daughter. This is Sue Monk Kidd's book. I don't know if you can see that or not. We could put it in the chat. The Dance of the Dissonant Daughter. She has an excellent understanding from a feminist point of view about Ariadne. And then in that understanding, she fell in love with Theseus, and Sue Monk Kidd describes Theseus as new ideas coming into being. Here he appears on the island, So there's a whole other wonderful way of understanding this myth, and Dennis, you've certainly helped me understand it much more deeply. And again, I don't know if I mentioned this clearly, but I didn't use the myth at all in the beginning at the cathedral. I always describe myself as where the rubber meets the road. And so this is where it met the road, and to have people be thinking about the Minotaur and things like that. At that time, this is 1991, right? It felt like a distraction. Now it's an addition. And so thank you very much, Dennis, for that.
Thank you, Lauren. Gosh, okay. Well, it's my job to just keep it moving on to our panel. John, you were just talking about being at this cathedral that she helped bring the labyrinth to. I wonder if you wanted to start us off.
Yeah, I first of all, just tremendous presentation, Dennis. Thank you so much for. I learned so much just listening, and wow, to sit at the feet of Lauren for a few moments here is just a real gift. So I'm still basking in all that we've been given tonight. I have been especially interested in the relationship between labyrinths and Christian pilgrimages throughout history. And I was reading about the situation that would sometimes occur when people couldn't go and make a pilgrimage, that it's been suggested that sometimes the labyrinths were used in substitution for those that couldn't go and make a labyrinth. And then beyond that, I've read a bit about the hand labyrinths, or labyrinths on the walls, for those that were unable to actually walk the labyrinth itself because of physical abilities, that powerful moments were experienced even through these labyrinths on the wall, or hand labyrinths that could be traced with the finger. And so I'm curious from both Lauren and Dennis's perspective, how you see the role of these labyrinths as substitution for pilgrimages, and even these wall labyrinths is playing into the larger discussion.
Mm-hmm. They're about the pilgrimage. Let's start there, because pilgrimages became associated with labyrinths, and certainly now, and pilgrimage is resurging since the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? All of Eastern Europe, that's open Eastern Europe. So pilgrimage is really a word that was kind of unfamiliar for people 10 years ago, and now really people are beginning to understand that more and more. Some people argue that that's not quite true, John, that that's a 17th century understanding of using the labyrinth symbolically. But whether it was done actually in those pilgrimages, and please understand, see, pilgrimage routes were cut off because of the Crusades. And often people confuse crusades and pilgrimages, and wait a minute, they were very different. But sometimes crusaders protected pilgrims going to the cathedrals. So that's partly why of that confusion. But if that didn't happen then, certainly people are using it now as a symbolic journey. That we're not walking, and the center, folks, even though it's blank, it is called in Chartres Cathedral, the New Jerusalem. So it's partly, tagging into the pilgrimage understanding of it. As far as wall labyrinths, the most famous one is in San Martino Cathedral in Lucca, Italy. And it's a early 1140 or so, and it's written, it's in the wall as you enter in the cathedral. And it was believed that it was a way of quieting the mind before you walk into the well-designed sacred geometry of the cathedral, which is also built to quiet the mind. And an interesting little footnote is the story of the Minotaur is carved in there in Latin right next to it. But contemporary wise, that was true. When we started at Grace Cathedral, we put up a finger labyrinth on one of the pillars and wheelchair height. So people could use that, and that might be also feeding into some of your understanding of that.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
The connection to the labyrinth for some people seems to be independent of that, because they're able to have the same. I personally do not have this connection, but they're able to take the finger labyrinth and substitute, perhaps not substitute, but use it in place of a physical walk. And it's been very effective. It's been very popular. And in fact, our cathedral reopened the labyrinth, oh God, almost 3 years ago now. And we still host monthly finger labyrinth meetings on Zoom, and they are still attended by dozens of people. So the connection is there. It's at this point inexplicable to me. I've been focusing on the neurological aspects of walking meditation, but not that, but the connection is real.
Thank you. Thank you. So helpful.
Yeah, Sheila, come on in. And obviously we want to get everybody into the conversation, and we'll open it all the way up.
Yeah, I'm going to direct this to Dennis because I'm interested in that deconstructive meditation. I'm going to read something, and I'm going to pull Dennis Patrick Slattery here too. Womb life lessons stored in the many filing places of the storehouse of your heart. That's Hugh of St. Victor. Remain the subtext of our life narratives unless we play attention, T-E-N-S-I-O-N, to the felt sense of them lying in the thin skin membrane of memory just below the waterline. Now that's Dennis Patrick's line, the thin skin membrane of memory just below the waterline. My question is this, because my work is all about prenatal and psychological. So Dennis, I don't mean to impose this thought on you, but if you or anyone else who has worked with labyrinths have come to any kind of what they call natalism. It's conscious or unconscious use of birthing language. You read it in your poem in the beginning, Dana. You actually mentioned birth. It's an archetypal womb, and it's right in the belly of the cathedral where the hips would be on a woman's body. So have you gotten any in this of the pre and perinatal mindset? And would this meditation, this deconstructive meditation, maybe help with letting these stories come up?
I have only been introduced to your work last week, Sheila, and by Dana. And so my time in travel and preparation for this has prevent me from really getting into your work yet, but which I look forward to. I would, off the top of my head, I would imagine that a mindfulness meditation approach would likely be more appropriate for me to begin those ideas, because I'm not familiar with the natal and prenatal ideas that you're talking about. And so the deconstructive meditation would be applicable for someone who has already done that work and has a notion of what they're trying to discover.
Mhm.
And because you have to have deconstructive meditation requires at least partial knowledge of what you're after, which is, I mean, every brand of psychology, going through the APA literature, every brand of psychology has a little different take on what an internal conflict is, just nuance in between them. But what seems to be universal across all branches of psychology is that most of what the conflict is unknown to the person who's enduring it. So one of the examples that's often given is that if you have a coworker that you don't really know, but just really irritates you, it's likely that that person reminds you of someone, or that person's mannerisms remind you of something that you're not fully conscious of. And a situation like that, where you have a starting point, would be a good application for deconstructive meditation, to have that dialogue. So if you have partial knowledge, my final response is, if you have some knowledge of what you're looking for, deconstructive meditation would be a wonderful path toward that. But I would begin, I personally, because I'm just so unfamiliar with your work, I would begin with a mindfulness approach to see what it is that comes up for me. And then once whatever came up, if I wanted to explore that further, then I would employ deconstructive meditation techniques.
Okay. And is that in the bibliography?
Yeah, it's mostly the work of a Cortland Dahl, who seems to be spearheading all of the research on deconstructive meditation. But yeah, I will send you the bibliographic information.
Okay, thank you.
As long as we're talking about pilgrimages and the relationship that pilgrimages as an archetype have to labyrinths, I'd like to hear what Phil might have to say about this, because, I mean, if we were ever blessed with a resource on pilgrimages, I mean, he is there, and we just draw a frame around him and not let him go and find out his wisdom. And maybe at this point you would also segue into a little self-promotion about your Myth Salon in a couple months, about how that relates to pilgrimages. But this is such a rich topic, and the chat is filled already. I have seen we overextended ourselves, Will. You know, there's just much more content that we can cover in this amount of time. But let's do our best. And Phil, welcome, and I'm sorry it took us this long to get to you.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Dennis and Lauren. Wonderful to hear you again. Everybody else chiming in. We only have a few minutes here, so I will try to be quick here and connect the two. 1997, I was looking for a new book idea, and I happened to be reading the New York Times travel section, and there was a little box, what they used to call a bullet point. And in there it said, pilgrimage or travel is about to become the world's #1 industry, surpassing the armaments industry, surpassing technology. Oh, sorry, new puppy wants attention. And so being a good reporter, I had to ask why, what was going on. So I did a little bit of research, and found out that there was a huge surge in the late 1990s in pilgrimage in the traditional Christian sense, but also the Jewish, the Muslim sense, and also in the world of secular travel. So the word pilgrimage was being used, to my great delight, to describe the rise of attendance at the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame, but also the home of Pele, the soccer football player in Brazil. Pilgrimage was also being used to describe reverential, respectful travel to parts of the world where we're witnessing now the disappearance of animals. Douglas Adams wrote a wonderful book about this. So I cobbled together this notion of the art of pilgrimage to describe what was happening in our world. And the book is outlined close to my 8 years of work with Joe Campbell. So there's a bit of a journey motif in there, but also very influenced by Mircea Eliade in his book, The Quest, but also his work on the sacred and the profane, in which he says something that helped really guide me in this way. And he said that it's a return to origins that helps revivify our dying soul. It's a return to where things began, which is another way of thinking about pilgrimage. Pilgrimage, as most of you probably know, comes from per agram in the Old Latin. It's to walk through the fields. But figuratively speaking, it's a walk in respect, in honor of one's own tradition. We are going to Jerusalem or Rome, Santiago de Compostela, Machu Picchu, to pay our respects, to pay homage, but also to recharge ourselves. James Hillman once told me that if you really want to understand this whole process of coming back to life after experiencing a kind of soul death, put the prefix RE in front of your verbs. And that's one way, I think, to understand pilgrimage. It's reintegration, revitalization, rejuvenation, right? We're going back. Edwin Edinger, the great Jungian analyst, writes about this beautifully. Going back to the origin where you began, or your faith, your tradition, something you deeply admire begins, going back to your own birth, right? I see you nodding vigorously there. Yes. That is where we will find the energy, the direction, and the numinosity in order to go forward again. So I came out with my book on the art of pilgrimage in 1998, and now it's in 15 plus languages around the world. I get mail virtually every day, not just email, but handwritten notes, handwritten letters, 5 or 6 pages long, from people on the Machu Picchu Trail, Santiago, all around the world. And what is the common thread? Lauren, to use the Ariadne's thread image again, which is how Theseus meanders his way. He threads his way through the labyrinth so he can get back out again after slaying the Minotaur. The Ariadne's thread is, I was feeling dead. I was at a crossroad in life. I did not know where to go. I needed to come alive again. So this motif of rebirth, maybe not an epiphany, that's a different discussion, but something is reborn in us when we go to that sacred site, be it Chartres or Avebury in England, the Standing Stones in Scotland, Callanish. These are places that Eliade has this wonderful term. He calls them places that exist in the strong time. It's the time outside of the clock. It's not chronological time. These are places in the strong time, which is outside of time and space, in which you can stand alone. And the eternals, the eternal verities, as Van Morrison calls them, comes to you. And you can consider things there that you can't otherwise. So Lauren, to hook back to hitchhike, on your point, as Angie Arian used to say, to consider the thread, to consider the star. Asterion was the name of the Minotaur in the center of the labyrinth. We have to consider what that means. Consider being the Old Latin for thinking underneath the stars. Considerus. You think about things in Chartres, where we'll be going next fall with Brian Swim, the great cosmologist, to consider things there that we can't quite consider the same way at home. This is one of the traditional motivations for pilgrimage. You have exhausted your friends. You've exhausted your spiritual counselors. No one knows how to help you. Help us again. This is a traditional way to say, I need to go on a walkabout. I need to go on a long, long trip to do what? Come back here. Come back to my center by going to the center. You feel the overlap in that? I am outside of myself. I'm out of touch with myself. So I will go back to the origins where it all began, where I began, right? To be recharged, revitalized. And as Eliade writes so beautifully in his book on the quest, this is the probably 60,000-year-old tradition of finding meaning again, if our world has become meaningless. And that's my conclusion for this then is this is partly the motivation for this precipitous rise in pilgrimage all around the world, including the 6,600 labyrinths that Lauren has helped launch because of the Labyrinth Project. The dirty secret, to conclude, in the travel business, where I've been leading tours, lectures, cultural tours, and so on for 40 some years, is that for most, we don't have to quantify it that way, for many, many travelers, it's meaningless. You can look on the faces of the hordes on the Acropolis, the hordes gathered in front of Notre Dame, the hordes in museums who are looking around like that dancer in the play A Chorus Line, asking, is that all there is? So much meaning has been bled out of, blanched out of modern travel, that the soul has this heliotropic function, which is the origin of psychotropic. If we allow ourselves to get back in touch with the soul, there is a turn. The psychotropic movement in the soul will point us towards the sacred site in which we can find some meaning to go forward again.
So thank you, Phil and Lauren and Dennis. I came tonight because I haven't thought about labyrinths. I've been through them a few, one at New Grange, but I hadn't thought about the depths that labyrinths contain until tonight. And then I started to think, I've spent the majority of my professional life teaching classics of literature, teaching poetry, teaching the Greek tragedians. Right now I'm teaching a 9-month course online on Melville's Moby Dick. And I realized, these classics are labyrinthine. And there are places, Lauren, thank you for bringing up Richard Rohr, one of my favorite writers. And incidentally, his director of curriculum is a graduate of the myth program at Pacifica. Who's a good friend. But what I realized is, and Dennis, thank you for leaning on the power of analogy, which you came back to again and again. Yeah, it's in the imagination. What vehicles do we get into to allow us to be transported to a new place, which Campbell thought was the power of the metaphor, is to allow us to carry something from this place to this place. And he also was firm about saying to us again and again, metaphors are the native tongue of myth. It's the way myths speak. So this has been really helpful for me, both personally and professionally, to see that this labyrinthine structure of the psyche is framing and structuring so many of the classics, but it's not come home to me until I've gone back to reread Moby Dick, in which the Cretan labyrinth becomes a central figure in the chapter entitled "The Counterpane," with Queequeg's tattooed arm over Ishmael as they're lying in bed, waking up in the morning. And Ishmael says, well, his arm blends right into the pattern of the blanket like a Cretan labyrinth. So I'm going to go back because I love the idea that you brought up. The Cretan labyrinth has never been seen.
but it's been analogized through the other sites, and so it's a figment of the imagination. Well, I'm going to use that as I continue to teach Moby Dick because it's a beautiful way to think about it. It's real and unseen. Yeah. So anyhow, just a few comments and much gratitude.
Whoa, we're on a roll. It just reminds me that when you take a topic that sparks the imagination, it can catch fire. And I really think, again, that we really ought to follow this up with some other discussion, because there's just so much more that we've got. I mean, the chat is like burning it up. My poor computer can't keep up with it, you know? And so, Dawn, you know, there must be various aspects as executive director of Veriditas that I'm sure you're a competent administrator, but there's more to you than running an organization. So what is it about running that organization that makes you want to connect the soul of the labyrinth with what you do?
What a great question. I wanted to start by giving a warm welcome, and we're ending, but a warm welcome to all our Veriditas community that I see listed as participants. And I think we've opened a new door here. I felt when I started with Veriditas 17 years ago that I was looking for some way of connecting the meaning and symbolism and metaphor of the whole dream realm to practical reality and to making things happen. And when I met with Lauren, I told her I was looking for something spiritual and creative. And she said, "Have I got a job for you?" So it's truly been a joy. I also have a way of thinking about an organization that may be a bit differently. I feel like we need not use the patriarchal model, and that it's about teams and circles and center and meaning. And I've really done my best to cultivate that in the organization. I'm very thrilled that to support our pilgrimages, and we have 2 coming up that I believe Lars put in the chat already, and excited to support both Jill Jeffreyon and Phil Cousineau and Brian Swim. So I'm hoping some of the folks who are on with us will join us, because it truly is a once in a lifetime experience that I've had the opportunity to do 20 plus times. So it's been great. And then I want to make sure, you know, we are known, Veriditas is known for its training of facilitators and facilitating the labyrinth we see as a spiritual path. So we welcome people into the training who want to bring the labyrinth into different environments. And it's very exciting, the different environments where the labyrinth has gone, everything from the birthing work that Sheila has so adeptly developed to prisons and community parks, etc. But in addition to that, we offer experiences which we hope bring meaning to people's lives. And so we have the pilgrimages and workshops. But every Friday we do a finger labyrinth walk on Zoom that's free. And we'd love to have any of you join us. It's amazing that during the epidemic, we were able to start the online walks, and they've been so, the first one had 400 people, which is extraordinary. Now it's kind of boiled down to somewhere between 60 and 100 folks on a regular basis. So we've developed the finger labyrinth more and the use of that because of the pandemic times. I see the labyrinth so much as a metaphor of wholeness in our broken times. And I hope you will all dip your toe into Viriditas in some way if you haven't already. Thank you, Dana. It's just been wonderful to be here, and I hope we do it again.
I've been sitting here thinking about questions I would ask for a month, and I'm sitting here with them knowing I'm not going to get any answers. So if we do get a chance to get back together, there are a couple things that are on my mind that I hope we might consider expanding into. And the first motif has to do with the thread. There's been a lot of mention around the golden thread, the thread of Zoe, the illuminated thread, and also the pilgrimage. And for me, the golden arrows on the Camino de Santiago are, of course, the golden thread, like the golden road, like the golden path that Hercules takes on his boat, like the sun around the world. And so I'm curious if we could expand in the future on that golden thread and how the labyrinth represents all kinds of narrative journeys and narratives of transformation that also relate to that narrative thread. And another question I hope that we could expand into another time is decapitation. We talked about the decapitated Minotaur a little bit, but also at Chartres Cathedral is the Green Man, the decapitated head of the Green Man. And so I'm very curious if we could eventually come back around to talking about that, because for me, the decapitated head is just an essential part of my understanding of what's going on in the labyrinth. As we look at, Joseph Campbell talks about the two tusks of the boar and the black face in the center representing the last crescent moon, the first crescent moon, and the darkness in the middle. And we did happen to do a wonderful labyrinth event some years ago, a Joseph Campbell Foundation roundtable at the Ojai Foundation with Kayleen, another one of our friends, Kayleen Asbo. And it just so happened that there was an eclipse on that day. And so we were able to time our going into the labyrinth with the going out of the sun, and the coming out of the labyrinth with the coming back of the sun. And I know John will be leading some eclipse events coming up. And anyway, I think a lot about that decapitation as a symbolic, defeat of the bull or defeat of that egoic self or something like this on the way down. But then that last crescent of death, giving way, the crescent blade, the crescent, sickle, etc., giving way to that first crescent horn. And I think some of you probably know that on Crete, they didn't just decapitate the bull, they drank from rhytons that were shaped like bulls' heads. And they drank from horns that they consumed their elixir through. So the point is that it wasn't just this decapitation, it was also the vessel for their elixir, going from that last crescent to that first crescent, that last tusk to that new tusk. So anyway, for me, that's been so critical. And I was really hoping to get a chance to hear from y'all on decapitation and narrative threads. And so hopefully another time. And thank you all. I've been moved a lot tonight.
Well, we really uncovered just a wealth of information on this, not only information, but perspectives. And one of the things I would like to say that I picked up from John Bucher's Atlas Obscura, And what people were talking about tonight is the labyrinth as a vehicle for bringing forth oneness or wholeness. And I think it was in your second talk, John, that I said, well, I wonder if there's a relationship between the labyrinth and the mandala. And, you know, we didn't talk about that tonight, but could you say something about the labyrinth and mandala, John?
Absolutely. You know, it goes back to this idea of centeredness and moving towards the center, moving towards that center of ourselves and finding that central place. I also, you know, with the mandala, think about, you know, the journey into the labyrinth is often what we talk about and think about with the Minotaur being at the center. But, you know, in many traditions around labyrinths, the labyrinth was a dark place. And finding your way back out of the labyrinth, unless you had a thread, was just as difficult and dangerous and could be the greater challenge would be finding your way back out of the labyrinth and all those curves and turns. And I think what the mandala, you know, does is it allows us to see that labyrinth type image from an aerial view, to see it from above, to see it from a distance where we get the entire picture. For the labyrinth, we often don't see the full picture because we're inside of it. So in a sense, I love how the mandala allows that inner view that we're seeing from a different perspective when it may be difficult to see the entire picture from inside the labyrinth itself.
How excellent. I'm noticing one thing in the chats that's coming up, and I would like to, we came here basically, so the whole idea of this started was with Dennis Hall's fabulous dissertation. And that was, I thought, enough for the dissertation. And then I found out about you, Lauren, in his dissertation. And when I was talking with Phil about this over dinner one night, he said, well, let's talk to her. I don't know whether she'll do this or not. And, you know, people are responding to how your organization, how Veriditas has relevance to not only labyrinths, but beyond labyrinths to the world that we live in. And I'm going to just throw out a parting shot and say, you know, we should extend this thing through Veriditas and figure out, now that we've launched this, what kind of a conversation can we bring forth on that? And I don't have an answer for it, but you and I, Lauren, maybe we'll talk more about this. I really, Dennis, I want to thank you for initially responding and then not copying an attitude when I pulled October out from underneath you, because I know you were disappointed. I mean, it was really like we'd booked the date, but you were so gracious and so appreciative, and look at what, you know, the fruits of gratitude have yielded. We have this incredible opportunity ahead of us, and this has just turned out to be as good as I had hoped it would be. And I really have you, Dennis and Lauren and Sheila and Dennis again, and John and Dawn, and of course Phil and Will. It takes a village, you know, and this is very, very cool for us to have taken this opportunity and to have run with it. But enough words, let's have a little bit of silence, and then we'll go on to our lives. Thank you, everyone. And thank you very much. I would also like to have a little bit of a shout out to Lars, because I discovered him last night. He builds labyrinths. without builders, we don't have them. He comes up with these things. If we were only talking about conceptual labyrinths, we'd be only talking about like the Palace of Knossos. They'd be wandering around looking for labyrinths that don't exist, but he actually puts them out there in the world. So again, thank you, Lars. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Wonderfully. Thank you all.